Have you ever walked into a strange place, and within seconds you knew that every eye was sizing you up, not through words, not through questions, but through silence, a silence that makes one feel small? In the American Wild West, at the end of the 19th century, people didn't ask a woman how she had lived. They looked, and with just one first glance her fate was almost sealed. That day in the town of Duston Creek, Montana Territory, a horse-drawn carriage stopped in the middle of a dusty road. A middle-aged woman stepped out. No silk dress, no gentle demeanor expected of a mail-order bride. Just a sturdy physique, calloused hands, and a face already marked by labor and the passage of time. Eleanor Whitmore stood there amidst curious, then scrutinizing, then judgmental gazes. No one said anything loudly, but the fleeting glances that lingered for too long said enough. In the West, a woman's worth is judged by her first impression, and if that impression isn't pleasing, does a woman have any chance left to prove herself worthy? Eleanor came here to start a new life. But at that very moment a quiet question arose, not just for her but for all of us. If you were standing alone in a strange town, knowing you're being judged solely on your body and appearance, would you turn and walk away, or stay and define your own worth? This story doesn't begin with love. It begins with choice. If you've ever felt silently disrespected, if you've ever had to swallow your tears to stay strong, then stay with us. Press like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can slowly journey into Eleanor Whitmore's story. A story that's not noisy, but can leave you speechless for a long time. Duston Creek wasn't a big town. Just a few rows of log cabins, a pub, a post office, and a dirt road that ran through it like a long scratch across the prairie. The wind carried the scent of dust, old wood, and the smell of lives yet to settle. The carriage rolled away, leaving Eleanor Whitmore standing alone as if the town had closed its doors behind her. She stood tall, not out of confidence but because it was the only way to avoid collapsing. The eyes of the people of Duston Creek glanced over her, then turned back again. They looked at her broad, more than average shoulders, at her worn dress, at her hands which bore the marks of hard labor. No one greeted me. No one welcomed me. Eleanor knew this feeling. The feeling of being judged before being heard. A feeling that an older woman in the West understood all too well. She didn't cry, at least not yet. In her mind, the words in the letter still resonated, polite, proper language, promising a home and a new beginning. She believed in those words long enough to sell off her old life and set off. Now, in the middle of Duston Creek, Eleanor understood that this new life wouldn't be easy, and perhaps it wouldn't be fair. But she stood there, waiting, not out of naivety, but because her dignity wouldn't allow her to run away on the first day. The mornings in Duston Creek drag on slowly, as if time here also carries the cautious habit of people who have been made wary by life. Eleanor Whitmore sat on a long wooden bench by the carriage station, her back straight, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. Her old brown hat shielded her from the rising sun, but it couldn't hide the growing sense of alienation in her chest. She had been there since the mist hadn't yet lifted from the ground. Initially, Eleanor believed she was early. In the West, it was said that men were not always punctual. She told herself this to keep her composure. Caleb Monroe was probably busy tying up his horse, or talking to an acquaintance, or simply running later than planned. She watched the dirt road leading into town. Each time she heard the sound of horse hooves, her heart skipped a beat, then sank when she realized it wasn't the person looking for her. Time passed in tiny ways. The sun rose higher. The shadows of the eaves shifted across the ground. A stranger stepped out of a car, greeted by a familiar pat on the shoulder. A young woman was hurried away by a relative as if afraid the mountain wind would chill her. Eleanor remained seated. She wasn't agitated. She didn't stand up or pace around. She had learned long ago that in moments like these, dignity lay in not letting others see her panic. But by midday, when her stomach began to rumble and her throat became dry, Eleanor understood that this was no longer a delay. No one came. There was no man named Caleb Monroe standing at the end of the street, searching for her in the crowd. No recognizing gaze, no calling of her name. Only the wind. And perspectives began to change. At first it was curiosity, then understanding. And then pity, a pity tinged with the bitterness of judgment. An older woman passing by shook her head slightly. A man leaned against a wooden post, a half-smile playing on his lips. Whispers spread loud enough for the target to hear without needing to be spoken aloud. Another woman abandoned. The remark wasn't directed at Eleanor, but it lingered behind her. Like a small stone thrown into still water, it didn't create a big ripple, but enough to spread painful circles. Eleanor didn't turn around. She didn't need to look to know what those eyes were fixed on her. In Duston Creek, this has happened before. Women arrive by mail with hope, and then they are left behind like substandard merchandise. She sat there a little longer, not out of hope, but because she needed to make sure she wasn't imagining his absence. When Eleanor stood up, her knees felt slightly stiff. Not from fatigue, but from a different feeling, the feeling one gets when forced to acknowledge a truth one had already anticipated. She walked toward the small tea shop nearby just to ask for a glass of water. But as soon as she stepped through the doorway, a man's voice spoke from behind her, neither lowered nor concealed. He probably saw her, and then changed his mind. A soft chuckle. No one objected. Eleanor paused for a very brief moment. She didn't turn. She didn't tremble. She had heard statements like that all her life, she just had never heard them said publicly as a conclusion. She drank her water slowly, paid the full price, and then stepped outside. The midday sun shone directly on her face, making her eyes sting. But Eleanor wouldn't allow herself to mistake the light for tears. She wondered, not for the first time in her life, whether she was wrong to believe that the words on paper could convey the true identity of the person behind them. Caleb Monroe wrote very carefully, no flowery language, no extravagant promises. That's what Eleanor believed. A man who doesn't talk much is usually a man of action. That's what she believed. Now that belief remains in Duston Creek, amidst the dust and the gazes of strangers. That afternoon, Eleanor returned to the bus station once more, not to wait, but to confront reality one last time. She needed to know where she stood in the truest sense. No one came. No letter. No message. No apology. There was only a stark, even cruel absence. A young man already drunk looked Eleanor up and down and uttered a remark as if he were commenting on an old horse. With that physique, what does she expect? This time Eleanor returned. It wasn't because she was angry. It was because she wanted to look directly at the world that had just judged her. Her eyes weren't sharp, not weak, just tired. The other man looked away first. Eleanor understood one thing very clearly, not with her intellect, but with a deep feeling in her chest. Caleb Monroe hadn't forgotten her. Caleb Monroe had chosen not to come, and that choice wasn't about who she was. It was about the perception that she wasn't worthy of keeping her word. The humiliation didn't erupt. It seeped in slowly, like the cold seeping through clothes to the skin. Eleanor walked toward the road leading into town, carrying her old suitcase. Each step was heavier than the last, but she didn't stumble. She was used to carrying burdens. She just never imagined she'd have to bear the weight of an unfulfilled promise. The afternoon drew to a close. The wind changed direction. Duston Creek began to quiet down again, as if everything that had just happened was merely a minor incident, not worth remembering for long. But for Eleanor Whitmore, that moment wouldn't disappear. It would remain, like a cut that doesn't bleed, but forces one to learn to live differently. And as Eleanor walked away, carrying with her the silence and her self-respect challenged to the very limit, she was unaware that another gaze was watching her from afar, not scrutinizing, not judging, simply observing quietly, as if waiting for the moment to enter the conversation. Eleanor Whitmore didn't know that amidst that seemingly inevitable abandonment, there was a man who had seen it all and chosen not to turn away. It was late afternoon when Eleanor Whitmore stopped in front of the cheapest inn in Duston Creek. The wooden sign hanging on the porch was faded, a corner chipped, swaying gently in the breeze. The place offered no comfort, only a roof and a bed sufficient for the night. Eleanor stood still for a few seconds before entering. It wasn't because she was hesitant about money. It was because she knew what awaited her behind that door. In small towns like Duston Creek, the inn is more than just a place to sleep. It's a place where people gather to observe, assess, and share stories that haven't yet faded. And today Eleanor understands perfectly she herself is that story. The wooden door creaked open, emitting a familiar sound. The smell of old wood sweat and cold food mingled together, creating a distinctive atmosphere of places people only visit when they have no other options. The inner conversation didn't stop immediately. It just slowed down like a stream blocked by a rock. Eleanor walked to the counter and placed her old suitcase at her feet. The owner, a middle-aged woman with a tired face, looked up at her. Her gaze wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. "Are there any rooms available?" Eleanor asked, her voice low and even. The shop owner nodded without asking any further questions. She handed her a wooden key with a faded number. Everything happened quickly, like a transaction devoid of emotion. Eleanor turned around, and at that moment she clearly felt the gazes. No one stared for too long. They looked, then turned away. Then they looked again, as if to make sure that what they suspected was true. She walked toward the stairs, each step echoing softly on the wooden floor. Each sound seemed to remind her that she was passing through a space not meant for privacy. In the corner of the room, several men sat around a table, their glasses half empty. They didn't speak softly, nor did they speak loudly. They spoke at just the right volume, not to be perceived as intentionally offensive, but loud enough for the person being referred to hear. "Is she the woman from the carriage this morning?" "That's right. Mail order bride." A soft snort was heard. "It's not like what's in the letter." No one laughed out loud. No one pointed a finger. Just quick glances, knowing nods. Silent agreement, the sharpest weapon of contempt. Eleanor stopped at the first step. It wasn't because her legs were tired, it was because she needed to maintain her balance. In that moment, so much could have happened. She could have turned back. She could have said something. She could have left the inn and walked out into the street, even as night fell. But Eleanor Whitmore did nothing. She took a slow breath. Then she continued walking. In the upstairs hallway, the voices from below faded but didn't disappear. They crept up the stairs through the cracks in the wood, as if to remind her that wherever she went in this town, people were still judging her. The room was small, just big enough for a bed, a basin of water, and a chair. The window overlooked a narrow alley behind the shop. There was no view, only the wooden wall of the building next door. Eleanor put her suitcase down. She sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't take off her shirt right away. She didn't lie down. She sat there, her hands resting on her knees, her back straight, as if she were in a public place. It was a habit of people accustomed to constantly maintaining their composure and avoiding collapsing under the gaze of others. The voices from below rang out again, this time clearer. "I heard that guy sold the land and left. That's clever. Who would marry someone like that?" Another deeper voice concluded. "Does not meet standards." 3 words, nothing more needed. Eleanor closed her eyes, not to avoid it, but to keep the tears from welling up right now. She had cried enough in her life, and she knew the value of not crying in front of others. In Duston Creek, even a single tear could be evidence of the vulnerability people were looking for. Eleanor got up and scooped up some water to wash her face. The cold water numbed her skin slightly, just enough to keep her emotions from getting out of control. She looked at herself in the small, distorted mirror. A middle-aged woman. Her face is not soft. Her body is not slender. But those eyes, despite their weariness, still looked straight ahead. Eleanor wiped her face slowly, not to look prettier, but to remember that she was still here. Below, the voices gradually shifted to other topics. That's how the town always is. Curiosity only lasts until there's something new to talk about. But Eleanor understood the mark had been made. She lay down on the bed when it was completely dark. She didn't take off her shoes right away. She just lay there looking at the ceiling, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the wooden floor. There is a very personal pain that only those who have been silently scorned can understand. It's not a direct insult, but the feeling of being judged without the right to defend oneself. Eleanor wasn't thinking about Caleb Monroe right now. She was thinking about herself. It's about years of hard work, about waking up early in the morning, about how these hands have built far more than those sitting below can imagine. She swallowed her tears. It wasn't because she was ashamed. It was because she knew that if she cried, it would be from exhaustion, not because they deserved her tears. The night in Duston Creek was strangely quiet. It was as if the town had finished its day's work judging a stranger, then leaving them to figure out the rest. Eleanor turned over and pulled the blanket up. No prayer, no resentment. Just a quiet acceptance that from this moment on everything would depend on her. And it was in that silence, in a cheap inn, in an unwelcoming town, that Eleanor Whitmore began to understand something important. If she doesn't see her own worth, no one else in Duston Creek will do it for her. The following morning, as Eleanor Whitmore left the inn, determined not to wait for anyone any longer, she had no idea that this very choice would lead her to her first crossroads, where the past and present would begin to collide. The morning in Duston Creek arrived quietly, as if the town wanted to avoid confronting what had happened the day before. A thin mist settled over the dirt road, obscuring the footprints of passers-by, but not the lingering sense of desolation in Eleanor Whitmore's heart. She left the inn early in the morning. It wasn't because she couldn't sleep, but because she understood that waiting any longer wouldn't change anything. Eleanor had given the silence enough time to explain itself, and the silence had spoken for itself. Today she didn't go out feeling abandoned. She went out with the decision of someone who needed to know the truth in order to continue living. Eleanor asked for directions to the land that once belonged to Caleb Monroe. She didn't ask many questions, just enough for someone to point towards a path leading to the edge of town. The looks that followed her were no longer curious, but had a tone of confirmation. She really is looking for him. She walked. She didn't hire a horse. She wasn't in a hurry. Each step was a way for her to keep herself steady. The morning wind was cold but clear. It helped Eleanor clear her mind more than any comfort could offer. Caleb Monroe's estate loomed before us, or rather, what used to be his. The wooden gate swung open. The fence was askew. The house was empty, windows closed, showing no sign of life. Eleanor stood and watched for a long time. There was no feeling of anger, nor was there a feeling of surprise. It was just a quiet void, much like how Caleb had vanished from her life. An elderly man repairing a nearby fence looked at Eleanor for a moment before speaking. His voice was neither harsh nor gentle. "Are you here to see Monroe?" Eleanor nodded. "He sold the land about a month ago," the man said, as if recounting a very ordinary event. "I heard he moved east. There are better business opportunities there." Eleanor remained silent, not because more information was needed, but because that one sentence was enough to put an end to all doubts. "Didn't you leave any letter?" she asked, her voice still even. The man shook his head. "At least nobody here saw it." Eleanor thanked him, then turned and left. On her way back to town, she stopped by the small land registry office, a wooden room with stacks of files taller than a person. The clerk flipped through the register, found Caleb Monroe's name, and then confirmed everything with a few brief sentences. "The sale is legal. All paperwork is complete. No obligations." Caleb Monroe left Duston Creek cleanly, as if Eleanor Whitmore had never existed in his life's plans. Eleanor stepped outside and stood in the midday sun. For the first time since arriving at Duston Creek, she no longer felt afraid of the stares around her. Because by now everything is clear. It wasn't because she was late. It wasn't because the letter was lost. It wasn't because of cruel fate. Caleb Monroe chose to leave, and that choice was made after he came to know what kind of person Eleanor Whitmore was. That truth didn't come like a blow. It came slowly and heavily. Eleanor stopped at the side of the road, placing her hand on her chest. Not to soothe her heart, but to identify the feeling spreading within it. It's not mere sadness. It's not anger. But it was a cold, stark, and cruel realization. I wasn't abandoned, but I was considered unworthy. That difference is very important. Being abandoned can be an accident. Being deemed unworthy, that's a judgment. Eleanor Whitmore stood tall. Her back was never hunched, not out of pride, but because life had taught her that bowing down for too long would leave her without the strength to stand up again. She remembered each letter, every carefully chosen word, every promise not to say too much. Now everything is revealed for what it truly is: convenience. Caleb Monroe wasn't looking for someone to build a life with. He was looking for a suitable option. And when that option didn't meet his standards, he changed his plans, no explanation needed. Eleanor didn't blame him. Not anymore. Because blaming requires the other person to value your feelings, and clearly Caleb Monroe never did that. On the way home, Eleanor walked more slowly. Not because she was tired, but because she was reorganizing her inner world. From this moment on, she was no longer a woman waiting to be chosen, no longer a mail-order bride, no longer a name in letters. She is Eleanor Whitmore, a woman standing in the middle of the town of Duston Creek, with a closed past and an uncertain future. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know how she would make a living. But she knew one thing very clearly: my worth no longer lies in the hands of a man who has turned his back on me. In the afternoon, Eleanor returned to the inn and tidied up her belongings. Not much. Life had never been about excess. She folded her clothes carefully, as if each small action was a way of affirming that she still had control. As the sun slowly set behind the wooden houses, Eleanor sat by the window watching Duston Creek turn its familiar ash gray. The town hadn't changed, only the way she saw it had, no longer expecting acceptance, no longer hoping for pity. Only one practical, simple but vital question remains: how am I going to live on? And it was in that very moment, when Eleanor Whitmore was no longer seeking anyone else to rely on, that her dignity began to speak, not loudly, not proclaiming, but firmly, clearly, like a solid foundation upon which to rebuild. When Eleanor Whitmore closed the final door on her past, she didn't know that a man had witnessed that unwavering silence, and that very silence was something he couldn't ignore. Not all views at Duston Creek are the same. Eleanor Whitmore didn't know that at first. To her, the town was just a series of fleeting glances, measuring, judging, then moving on. But amidst all those glances, there was one that held no questions. Thomas Hale stood on the other side of the road near the second-hand shop he usually visited when coming down from the mountain. He wasn't leaning against the wall. He wasn't crossing his arms. He just stood there, as steady as an old tree accustomed to strong winds. He came to Duston Creek not because of rumors, not out of curiosity, just for salt ammunition and a few supplies needed for the coming winter. Thomas Hale was a man of the mountains. He lived in isolation. He was taciturn. He disliked town, but understood that sometimes people still needed to reconnect with other people. He had seen Eleanor Whitmore the previous morning. A woman stepped down from the carriage with a posture that was not graceful but upright. Thomas paid no attention to what others saw. He noticed how she stood still amidst their gazes. A person who has lived in the forest for many years learned this way of observing. Don't look at what makes noise, look at what stands firm. Thomas didn't know Eleanor's name. He didn't know where she was from. He didn't know why she stayed at the Duston Creek bus station for so long. But he saw the moment when no one came to pick her up. He saw a subtle movement on her face, not disappointment but adjustment, as if she had redirected an inner thought in order to continue standing upright. And then Thomas Hale saw more than that. He saw Eleanor enter the cheap inn. He saw the eyes that followed her. He saw the smiles that were not hidden. Thomas disliked such places, not because he feared conflict, but because he didn't want to interfere in matters that weren't yet at the point of needing to be addressed. In the mountains, reacting too quickly wastes your energy. The same is true in life. Thomas Hale entered the inn after Eleanor, not at the same time, and without drawing attention. He ordered a cup of black coffee and sat in a corner of the room where he was clearly visible, but no one was forced to look back. He heard the words, "No need to try." He didn't frown. He didn't shake his head. Just acknowledgement. The man made a comment about Eleanor's appearance. Another person chimed in. Then a silent agreement spread like smoke. Thomas took a sip of coffee. Bitter. Just the right taste. He wasn't looking at Eleanor at that moment. He was looking at the people who were speaking, the way they sat, the way they laughed, the way they believed they were on the safe side of the majority. Thomas Hale had encountered people like that all his life. In town, at hunting posts, in places where people thought their voices carried weight simply because no one else objected. Eleanor Whitmore walked up the stairs. Thomas watched, not as a man looks at a woman, but as someone observing an unfinished situation. He didn't intervene, not out of indifference, but because Eleanor didn't yet need anyone to step in for her. There are pains that need to be endured alone to become strength. Thomas Hale understood that. The mountains taught him. That evening, Thomas left the inn early. He didn't sleep in town. Never. He returned to his wooden hut on the hillside where the oil lamp provided enough light and the silence carried no judgment. But the image of that woman remains. It wasn't her face. It was the way she didn't give up. The next morning, Thomas went down to town again. This time he arrived earlier than usual. He saw Eleanor leaving the inn. Alone. In no hurry, without trying to hide. She walked toward the old plot of land, the place that once belonged to a man who never appeared. Thomas didn't follow. He didn't need to. When Eleanor turned back, her eyes were different. No longer searching, no longer waiting. Only the cold clarity of someone who had just understood something important. Thomas Hale recognized that moment. It is the moment when a person no longer stands at the crossroads of hope and despair, but stands tall at the starting point of their choice. As evening fell, the Duston Creek community gathered again. They talked. They judged what didn't concern them. A man mentioned Eleanor Whitmore again, not maliciously, just as a side story. But Thomas heard it. He stood up. Don't rush. Don't get angry. He stepped outside and stood near where Eleanor was tying up her old suitcase. He said nothing. He didn't stare. He just stood there, a steadfast presence. The man saw Thomas Hale, then stopped speaking. Not out of fear, but because there are people who don't need to speak to change the atmosphere. Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to. Eleanor sensed the change. She looked up. Her eyes met Thomas's for the first time. No prying, no pity, no curiosity. Just a straight, calm gaze without asking questions. Eleanor Whitmore turned away first. Thomas Hale didn't call out. Two people, each with their own past, met in a silent understanding. Thomas didn't know what he would do next. He only knew one very simple thing. That woman is not a story to be talked about. She is a person standing at a difficult crossroads, and Thomas Hale is the kind of person who doesn't enter someone's life with promises. He only enters when his presence can make a real difference. As the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas left Duston Creek, returning to the familiar trail. But this time, he knew he would return not for the town but for a woman who had chosen to stand firm in the face of judgment. A few days later, when Eleanor Whitmore had nowhere else to go and was forced to choose between continuing to endure or leaving Duston Creek, Thomas Hale stepped in, not with promises, but with an offer real enough to change everything. The afternoon in Duston Creek dragged on slowly, as if the town itself were considering whether to keep those who didn't belong there. The wind blew along the dirt road, carrying fine dust and the scent of old wood. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the edge of town, her suitcase at her feet, her hands resting on the handles as a habit, not to prepare to leave immediately but to remind herself that she still had a choice. She didn't know where she was going. Leaving Duston Creek was the obvious choice. But beyond this town lay only mountains, long trails, and places not meant for those who wandered alone for too long. Eleanor understood that all too well. She had lived long enough to know that hope needed to be accompanied by reality, otherwise it was nothing more than self-deception. It was at that moment that Thomas Hale appeared. Not sudden, not attention-grabbing. He emerged from the antique shop, his gait unhurried, as if there were no urgency to be addressed. Thomas didn't call out to Eleanor. He didn't approach too closely. He stopped a few steps away from her, a distance sufficient to avoid intruding, but not so far as to appear indifferent. Eleanor sensed its presence before she heard its voice. A low, even voice, lacking the usual curiosity. Is she leaving town soon? Not a pressuring question, not an inquisitive remark. Just a simple confirmation. Eleanor turned around. She recognized the man not because they had spoken, but because she remembered that non-judgmental gaze. She nodded slightly. I have no reason to stay, she replied. Her voice wasn't sad, nor was it harsh. It was simply truthful. Thomas Hale was silent for a moment. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask about the man who hadn't come. He didn't ask about what this town had done to her. Thomas had a very clear principle: what isn't willingly shared doesn't need to be delved into. He looked at the road behind Eleanor, the road leading out of Duston Creek, then looked back at her. I live in the mountains, he said. That's all. Eleanor didn't answer immediately, not because she was suspicious, but because she was listening more than reacting. Her instinct after the past few days was to slow down, not to rush to believe nor to rush to reject. Thomas continued, his voice still as even as before. I have a house. Not big, not rich. He paused as if to make sure he was saying the right thing. But it's safe. The last 3 words are not stressed. They are not bolded. They were simply laid down as firm as a rock. Eleanor looked at Thomas Hale. For the first time since arriving at Duston Creek, a man spoke to her without trying to persuade her. No promises of the future. No vision of happiness. Not a single word that meant, I will save you. It's just a very specific fact. A house, not for the rich, but safe. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Many questions ran through her mind. Why did he do this? What did he expect? Did he know anything about her? But what made Eleanor stand still wasn't the questions themselves. It was the fact that Thomas Hale didn't demand any answers from her. You don't need to decide now, Thomas added, as if reading the hesitation in her eyes. I'll leave town before dark. He didn't say, come with me. He didn't say, I need you. It was simply a matter of presenting a possibility and then letting Eleanor Whitmore choose for herself. It was a very strange moment. Not dramatic, not emotionally moving in a loud way. But for a woman accustomed to being judged, chosen, and overlooked, that moment carried the weight of something rare, respect. Eleanor took a slow breath. He knows nothing about me, she said. Thomas nodded. Yes, he doesn't know where I'm from. No need. He doesn't know why I'm here. Thomas looked directly at her. What I need to know. I've seen. Eleanor didn't ask what did you see. She knew the answer lay in the way he stood there, not leaning toward her nor stepping back. A rare balance. The wind blew harder. Duston Creek behind them began to light up. The town was still the same, still laughing, still judging, still going about its life without waiting for anyone. Eleanor looked at the suitcase at her feet. It wasn't heavy, but what was inside, both tangible and intangible, was much heavier. Is your house far away? She asked. Thomas Hale paused for a moment. Far enough to be quiet. Eleanor nodded. It's not an agreement. It's just an acceptance to listen further. Thomas turned, preparing to leave. No urging, no looking back. A man accustomed to living alone understands very well the value of giving others space. Eleanor watched his back, tall, sturdy, unhurried. The back of someone accustomed to carrying the burdens of life without needing an audience. She didn't know if she would follow that path or not. But for the first time since leaving her old home, Eleanor Whitmore felt she was facing a choice not based on despair. It wasn't because she had no way out. Rather, a new path had opened up, not glamorous, not promising, but real enough to warrant consideration. Eleanor picked up the suitcase. Don't follow Thomas right away, nor turn your back on Duston Creek. She stood there for a little longer, to make sure that whatever the choice, it was truly her own. As the sun set behind the mountains and Duston Creek sank into its familiar darkness, Eleanor Whitmore understood that her upcoming decision would not simply be about leaving a town, but about leaving the way she had been perceived and stepping into a completely different life. Night falls slowly in Duston Creek, as if the town wants to prolong its last vestiges of power over those who haven't yet left. Oil lamps flicker in the wooden windows, casting a weary yellow light, not warm enough to comfort but revealing enough. Eleanor Whitmore sat on the narrow bed in her boarding house, her suitcase at her feet. She didn't open it. She didn't close it. She just left it there like an unanswered question. The room was so silent that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, slow but heavy. Each beat seemed to carry a question she had avoided all day. Am I running away, or am I saving myself? At Eleanor's age, one is no longer easily swayed by impulsive decisions. Each choice carries the memory of past mistakes. And memories sometimes are what people fear most. She thought about Thomas Hale. Not in the way a woman thinks about a man. No daydreaming, no romanticization. Eleanor thought of him as a door that had just been opened, and the most frightening thing wasn't stepping through it, but not knowing what lay behind it. Thomas asked nothing. He asked nothing. He made no promises. That's what made Eleanor uneasy. For all her life she had been accustomed to men who talked a lot. Talked about the future, talked about stability, talked about everything will be all right. And it was those words, not the silence, that made her board the carriage to Duston Creek. Thomas Hale is different. He only said one thing: safety. Eleanor rose and walked to the window. From there she saw the dirt road that ran through the town, the road she would continue to walk tomorrow if she stayed under the unchanging gazes of the onlookers. She pictured the days to come if she didn't leave. Meals in silence, familiar glances, whispers that no longer need to be concealed. In Duston Creek she would always be the abandoned woman, not because she was weak, but because this society needed a label to reassure itself. Eleanor Whitmore understood a simple truth very well. Staying here wasn't about standing firm. Staying here was about being worn down day by day. She turned around and sat down on the bed. Her hands rested on her thighs, firm, not trembling. Fear arises not violently but persistently. Afraid of the mountain path, afraid of the harsh life, afraid that one day Thomas Hale's silence would no longer be a sign of respect but of distance. But, at the same time, another feeling crept in, very subtly. Hope. Not hoping for love, not hoping for protection. Rather, it's the hope that somewhere else I can exist without needing an explanation. Eleanor recalled Thomas's gaze when he said, "You don't need to decide now. A man who gives you time is someone who doesn't try to hijack your choices." She took a deep breath. Then, Eleanor Whitmore stood up. No drama, no tears. She opened her suitcase. She rearranged familiar items, dresses, scarves, a few small accessories. She didn't bring anything unnecessary. She had learned long ago that starting over requires letting go. When Eleanor stepped out of her room, the hallway was dark and quiet. No one looked. No one asked. The town was asleep, or pretending to be asleep. Outside, the wind was colder. The Montana sky stretched out full of stars, as if to remind us that the world is much bigger than a small town and its narrow judgments. Thomas Hale is waiting at the edge of Duston Creek. Don't rely on horses. Don't look at the clock. He stood there as if he knew that if Eleanor came, she would come her way. Eleanor stopped a few steps away from him. "He's still here," she said. Thomas nodded. "I told you so. Nothing more." Eleanor looked at the road ahead, the long, dark road leading into the mountains. Then she looked back at Duston Creek where the oil lamps were fading. One last time. She didn't hate the town, nor did she forgive it. She just left. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing or not," Eleanor said. Thomas Hale looked at her for a long time, then replied, "Nobody knows." That simple truth made Eleanor chuckle softly, a very small, rare laugh. "But I know one thing," she continued. "If I stay, I won't be myself anymore." Thomas didn't object. He didn't offer any advice. He simply stepped aside, clearing a path. Eleanor Whitmore lifted the suitcase. The first step was very difficult. The second step was a little easier. By the third step, she realized she was breathing more evenly. Each step away from Duston Creek was a weight lifted off her shoulders. Not completely, but enough for her to feel her chest no longer constricted as before. Thomas walked ahead, not too fast, without constantly turning his head. He knew perfectly well this was the path Eleanor needed to walk on her own 2 feet. When the town was completely out of sight, Eleanor stopped. Not because of regret, but because of a sudden feeling of relief. She was no longer being watched, no longer being measured. She was just a woman walking in the night, carrying her fear, but also herself. Eleanor turned to Thomas Hale. "I don't need you to promise anything," she said. Thomas nodded. "I have nothing to promise either." They continued walking. The path up the mountain was rugged but firm. The moon illuminated the way. The wind was cold but clean. And in that silence, Eleanor Whitmore realized something that she might only dare to admit in her lifetime. The scariest decision isn't following a stranger. Rather, it's about daring to leave the place that has made you feel small. As the last lights of Duston Creek faded behind the mountains, Eleanor Whitmore stepped into a new life, one where each day was measured not by sight, but by labor and presence. The path up the mountain is not welcoming to strangers. It was rugged, narrow, and in many sections barely wide enough for one person to walk through. The rocks were jagged and tree roots protruded from the ground like ancient tendons. For Eleanor Whitmore, every step was a challenge, not because she was weak, but because the mountain showed no mercy to anyone. Thomas Hale walked ahead, carrying most of the luggage. He didn't ask Eleanor if she was tired. He didn't urge her on. He simply maintained a steady pace, slow enough for her to keep up, steady enough not to get lost. Eleanor stopped when the wooden house appeared in the middle of the clearing in the woods. It wasn't because she was exhausted. It was because the silence here was unlike anywhere else she had ever known. There was no whispering, no eye contact, only the wind, the smell of pine resin, and the distant chirping of birds. Thomas Hale's house wasn't big. One story, rough wood, low roof, but it stood firm, just like the man himself. "This is home," Thomas said. "Nothing more." Eleanor nodded. She offered no comment. She had learned that some places needed no praise. Their value lay in their ability to endure through the years. The first day passed in pure exhaustion. There was no time for much thought. The mountain demanded the full presence of the body. Eleanor learned to carry water from the stream not far from her house. The water was cold, heavy, and unforgiving to her untrained hands. Her shoulders ached, her back stiffened. But Eleanor didn't complain. She was used to working before, just never in a non-judgmental environment. Thomas gave just enough guidance, no lengthy explanations, no doing things for her. He gave her the necessary tools, then let her find her own rhythm. Making a fire was the thing Eleanor learned slowest. The mountain wind is unlike the plain wind. It changes direction abruptly. It extinguishes impatient fires. Eleanor failed several times. The embers cooled before they could ignite. The smoke stung her eyes. She stood there, letting out a long sigh. Thomas didn't smile. He didn't seem impatient. He simply said, "Wait." One word, but enough. Eleanor waited, observed, adjusted. When the fire finally flared up, not large but steady, she didn't cheer. She simply sat down, brought her hand close, and felt the warmth spreading. A warmth that needs no permission. In the days that followed, life began to settle into a rhythm. Morning, fetch water, gather firewood, prepare a simple meal. Noon, dry meat, check traps, organize food. Evening, eat in silence, repair broken items. There's no schedule on the wall, but everything has its own order. Eleanor realized something very strange. Her body, which had once been criticized, was now suited to this place. Her shoulders were broad enough to carry water without wobbling. Her calloused hands could withstand the cold and the sharp edges of wood. Her back was strong enough to bend down and stand up many times a day. In Duston Creek, those features used to be considered substandard. Here they are an advantage. No one gave praise, but everything got done. Every evening, Eleanor would sit in front of her house, watching the forest change color as the sun set. She was tired, but it was a pleasant tiredness devoid of self-pity. Thomas Hale was even quieter than Eleanor had imagined. But his silence wasn't heavy. It was like the ground, always there, needing no proof. Sometimes he would give Eleanor a newly carved wooden spoon. He would set it down on the table, without saying a word. Sometimes he would fix the leaky roof before the rain came. No need to mention it. Eleanor saw and understood. At this age, one doesn't need grand affirmations. Just knowing that their presence counts is enough. For the first few nights, Eleanor slept restlessly. The mountains had their own sounds, the snapping of branches, the distant calls of animals, the whistling of the wind through the rocks. But each morning she woke up in her house, still standing, and that gradually created a nameless sense of security. There were times when Eleanor felt tired and thought about Duston Creek. Not with resentment, but with distance. She realized that what hurt her most in that town wasn't the words, but the fact that she wasn't recognized for what she did. Here nobody asks who she is. They just need to know what she accomplished today. One day Eleanor brought home more water than usual. Thomas looked at it and said, "You didn't need to bring that much." Eleanor replied, "It might rain tomorrow." Thomas nodded. No argument. Respect is built through small moments like these. The more Eleanor worked, the more she felt something changing inside her. Not loud, not dramatic, but certain. She no longer looked in the mirror wondering how she looked. She looked at her hands and found them useful. Labor doesn't erase the past, but it restores to people a sense of belonging to the present. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat preserving food for the winter, Thomas stood watching her for a long time. Then he said very softly, "You did a good job." Just 4 words. But Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't because she was overwhelmed with emotion. It was because it had been a long time since she had been recognized for what she did without any conditions attached. She didn't answer immediately. She just nodded. A nod was enough. That evening, Eleanor sat longer by the door, watching the forest darken. She realized a very simple truth. It is not love that revives people first. It is meaningful work. When people realize they can contribute, build, or keep a home warm through the winter, their self-esteem naturally returns. Eleanor Whitmore was no longer a woman who had been abandoned. She was a living person. And it is in this slow, steady, unpretentious way of life, amidst the harsh mountains and forests, that another kind of bond begins to form. No rush. No need to name it. But it becomes increasingly clear. When work became a shared rhythm for both of them, the silence between Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Hale began to take on a new meaning, no longer a distance but a place where feelings quietly grew. Life in the mountains doesn't change much from day to day. It changes with the seasons, with the weather, with small things repeated long enough to become routine. For Eleanor Whitmore, it was this repetition that brought a sense of peace she never knew she needed. Evening arrived earlier, as autumn began to approach. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the trees, casting long shadows on the wooden porch. Eleanor and Thomas Hale usually finished work when it was still light enough to see each other's faces, clearly not because they needed to see, but because it was the most logical rhythm of life. They ate dinner in silence. It wasn't a forced silence. Nor was it a silence born from a lack of words. It's just that after a day of work, words become unnecessary. Their meals were simple, dried meat, bread, and sometimes hot soup, if Eleanor had time to prepare it. Thomas always ate slowly, as if he didn't want to miss anything. Eleanor noticed this and began to slow down as well. They didn't ask each other how their day was. They had already seen it. One evening the wind was stronger than usual. The roof creaked, and a plank came loose. Thomas got up and grabbed a hammer. Eleanor didn't ask if he needed help. She took a lamp and followed him onto the roof. It was cold. The wind was strong. Eleanor's hands were numb from holding the lamp. Thomas hammered the nails in firmly without rushing. Not a word of complaint. When they finished, they sat down on the steps. Eleanor offered Thomas a dry towel. He took it and nodded. A very slight nod. "No, thank you," was said. But they both knew. Days like these followed one another. Eleanor was used to hearing Thomas's footsteps in the house, never heavy, never abrupt. Thomas was used to Eleanor getting up a little earlier than him, lighting the fire before dawn. They didn't touch each other much. They didn't intentionally keep their distance. It's simply respect that forms a natural boundary. A boundary doesn't drive people apart, it makes every step closer meaningful. On some evenings after dinner, Eleanor would sit mending clothes and Thomas would repair his hunting tools. The oil lamp cast a soft, warm light, just enough for 2 adults who had experienced enough ups and downs to no longer need to prove anything. Eleanor realized something that surprised her. She no longer thought much about the past. It's not because it's disappeared. It's because there's so much of it now that there's no need for comparison. Thomas Hale didn't ask Eleanor about what she had lost. He didn't need to know how she had been treated. The only thing that mattered to him was whether she was here working with him and keeping this house standing. And Eleanor did just that. Once, when Eleanor brought water into the house, Thomas took the heavy bucket. Their hands touched for a very brief moment. Neither withdrew their hand quickly. Neither squeezed tightly. It was just a very light touch, enough for both of them to realize that the intimacy had been there all along, it just hadn't been given a name. Eleanor turned away first. Thomas continued with his work. But from that day on, the evenings seemed a little warmer. It wasn't because of the weather. It was because the other person's presence had become a natural part of the space. No flirtatious remarks, no lingering gazes. Trust is built only through small actions. Another evening, when it suddenly started raining, Eleanor noticed water leaking into the corner of the house. She set the basin down and waited. Thomas came over, examined the leak, and repaired the roof that very night. Eleanor didn't stop her. She stood there, holding the lamp. Then, when everything had calmed down, Thomas said something very softly. "This house needs 2 people." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She understood that it wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a promise. It's just an acknowledgement. Yes, she replied. One word, but enough. Time passed, and with it their bond grew stronger, not in words, but in the fact that neither could imagine life without the other. Eleanor began to notice that when she went out more than usual, Thomas would wait on the porch. No look at his watch. No sign of worry. Just stand there. Thomas also noticed that whenever he came home late, Eleanor always left him a hot meal. She didn't ask why. She didn't scold him. Those things aren't called love, but they last far longer than any words of love ever spoken. At this age, people no longer need impulsiveness. They need stability. Eleanor understood that if this was love, it was a late-blooming love. But it wasn't rushed. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't conditional. It was like the fire they lit each night, not a huge blaze, but enough to keep them warm all night long. One evening, as the snow began to fall, Eleanor and Thomas sat closer to the stove than usual. Neither of them moved their chairs forward. It was just that the distance between them naturally narrowed. Eleanor looked at the fire. Thomas looked at his hands. Nobody said anything. But in that silence, one thing was clear to both of them. True feelings don't need to be expressed. It's proven by the fact that they choose to stay every day. Eleanor Whitmore was no longer a woman seeking refuge. Thomas Hale was no longer a man living in isolation. They didn't change their nature for each other. They simply adjusted their lives to make room for the other person. And that's what makes this bond so strong, unpretentious, not easily broken. Just as Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Hale had become accustomed to standing silently beside each other, a new challenge began to emerge, not to break that bond, but to prove just how deep it was. Autumn has crept deep into the mountains. The mornings were colder, the dew lingered longer on the ground, and each step outside required an extra layer of clothing. Eleanor Whitmore was used to it. Her body now reacted naturally to the weather, without complaint, without hesitation. That morning, Thomas Hale was preparing to descend the mountain to trade some salt and ammunition with an acquaintance from a nearby town. Eleanor did not go with him. She stayed behind, rearranging the food supplies for the winter. It was an ordinary morning. Nothing unusual. The strange man appeared around midday. A herdsman passing by stopped to ask for water. Thomas went outside first. Eleanor stood inside, still able to see everything through the open window. They spoke briefly. Just the essentials. The weather, the mountain roads, the price of salt. Then, as was the ingrained habit of those who carried news from elsewhere, the man chuckled softly, not with obvious malice, but enough to signal that something was about to be said. I heard he lives with a woman from Duston Creek. The words were uttered as gently as the wind. No accusations, no direct insults, just a small spark of prejudice. Eleanor stood still. She didn't flinch. She didn't step forward. She had heard such things enough times in her life to know that her reaction at this moment was not up to her. Thomas Hale did not respond immediately. He set the ammunition pouch back down on the wooden platform, adjusted the strap. Every movement was slow and decisive. There was no sign of tension, no preparation for confrontation. The other man continued, his voice lowering slightly as if sharing something he already knew. They say she wasn't chosen by anyone. Apparently she's a mail-order bride who was abandoned. No one raised their voice. No one laughed loudly. But in that atmosphere, Eleanor Whitmore's honor was being treated as a mere story for entertainment. Thomas looked up. He looked directly at the other man. No anger, no frown, just a look that wouldn't allow what had just been said to continue. Then he spoke. Just one sentence. No raising of the voice, no emphasis. Under my roof, no one is offended. Nothing more to add. The wind blew across the open space between the two men. The stranger stood still as if he had just realized he had crossed a boundary that no one needed to draw beforehand. He cleared his throat, changed the subject, took a sip of water, nodded, and then quickly excused himself. The dialogue has ended. There is no conflict. There are no winners or losers. But one thing has been established very clearly. Thomas Hale went back inside the house. Eleanor remained standing there. She didn't ask what had happened. There was no need. She looked at Thomas. He looked back. No one said thank you. No one offered words of reassurance. Because what just happened wasn't an act of heroism, it was a matter of principle. Eleanor returned to her work. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a feeling of being protected in the right way. It's not about overprotecting. It's not about stepping in to take their place. It's simply about setting clear boundaries for the outside world. In the afternoon, Thomas repaired the fence. Eleanor brought him a glass of warm water. They stood next to each other, as they did every day. But something has changed very subtly. It wasn't a sudden surge of emotion. Rather, it was a sense of security that was placed in the right place. Eleanor Whitmore had been defended before, with loud words, boisterous gestures, and all of that in the end made her feel weaker. But today, Thomas Hale did the opposite. He didn't say Eleanor was a good woman. He didn't claim she deserved it. He simply said that under his roof insults had no place. That's enough. That evening they ate dinner in their usual silence. But Eleanor noticed that when Thomas placed the plate of food in front of her, he held it a little closer than usual, a very small, very subtle gesture. She understands. It's not about possession. It's about affirmation. Eleanor looked down at her hands. Hands that had once been scorned. Hands that now held a warm home. She thought about Duston Creek, about the whispers, about the glances. They are all so far away now. It's not because they've disappeared. It's because they no longer have the right to touch her. Eleanor Whitmore was not defended by violence, not by fame, not by justification. She was protected by a simple and firm moral boundary. And that's what made her realize a profound truth. Mature love doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be strong enough to say no to insults. As night fell, Eleanor stood on the porch gazing up at the starry sky. Thomas stood beside her. They didn't touch. There was no need. You didn't have to do that, Eleanor said softly. Thomas didn't turn around. I know. A moment of silence passed. But I will always do that, he continued. Not a promise. A declaration of a way of life. Eleanor nodded. Her throat tightened not from overwhelming emotion but because a very deep part of her had just been healed. Honor, something she thought she had lost at Duston Creek, turned out never to have disappeared. It was just waiting for a place of enough respect to acknowledge it. And just when Eleanor Whitmore felt truly safe in Thomas Hale's presence, life presented them with an even greater test, where affection was no longer proven by words, but by staying together through the most difficult times. Winter arrives in the mountains without warning. It didn't knock. It didn't give any time to prepare. One morning Eleanor Whitmore opened the door and found the world had changed color. White, silent, and so cold that the breath she exhaled vanished into thin air. Thomas Hale had gotten up earlier than usual to check the traps. Eleanor watched him disappear behind the snow-covered trees. A very subtle feeling passed through her, not anxiety, just the awareness that this season demanded more caution than usual. That afternoon Thomas came home late. It wasn't too late, but long enough for Eleanor to notice something was amiss. His gait was slower, his shoulders slumped. When he entered the house, she clearly saw that his complexion had changed, pale and dry. "Are you cold?" Eleanor asked. Thomas shook his head. "It's all right." But those who have lived in the mountains for a long time learn not to completely believe the phrase, "it's okay." That night Thomas had a fever. It wasn't severe at first, just a persistent, low-grade fever that made his breathing heavier than usual. Eleanor sat by his bedside, changing the towels, boiling water, and keeping the fire burning. Thomas was in a semi-conscious state. He didn't say much. He only called her name once, very softly. "Eleanor." She replied immediately, "I'm here." That's all. The next morning the snow fell even heavier. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood. The house stood firm, but the outside world had closed in. Thomas couldn't get up. His fever rose. His breathing became rapid. His once steady hands trembled slightly. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time since coming to the mountains, she felt afraid. It wasn't a vague fear. It was a very real fear. If he didn't make it, she would lose something she had never dared to name. Eleanor Whitmore was never promised anything. Thomas Hale never spoke of the future. Never said we. Never said forever. And that's why this fear is so raw and unmasked, not shielded by any oaths or commitments. Eleanor had no choice but to stay. She did everything by herself, chopping firewood slower, heavier, carrying water, freezing cold, numbing her hands, cooking porridge, boiling medicine from what she remembered Thomas used for himself. At night, Eleanor slept very little. She sat beside the bed, listening to each breath. Sometimes Thomas's breathing weakened and she would place her hand on his chest, not praying aloud, just keeping herself calm. There were moments when Eleanor considered going down the mountain to find help, but the snow was thick, the roads were slippery, and Thomas couldn't move. She stayed. It's not about courage, it's about love, which, when it comes late, often doesn't allow one to leave. On the third day, Thomas became more delirious. Eleanor changed his clothes, wiped him down, and kept the house warm. She didn't cry. She wouldn't allow herself to. She knew perfectly well that if she fell, no one else would stand here either. In the middle of the night, when the wind was strongest, Eleanor heard Thomas whispering. The words were unclear, just fragmented memories. She leaned down, bringing her ear closer. "Don't be alone." Eleanor closed her eyes. For the first time in years, a deep-seated fear surfaced. Not the fear of being alone, but the fear of returning to life before this person came into my life. She took Thomas's hand. His hand was burning hot, but he responded very gently. "You're not alone," Eleanor said. Her voice was deep and firm. "I'm here. Not a promise. It's the reality that's happening." On Wednesday, the snow stopped falling. The sky was gray but calm. Eleanor took the opportunity to go outside, repair the roof, and check the firewood. Everything was done slowly but precisely. She did it as if Thomas would need all of these things when he woke up. It's not if, it's when. Eleanor didn't allow herself to think otherwise. That afternoon, Thomas's fever began to subside, very slowly, but enough for Eleanor to notice the change. His breathing became more regular. His hands trembled less. She sat down on the floor, leaning against the bed, and for the first time in days, allowed herself to sigh. "Not because I'm tired, but because I have just enough hope to keep going." When Thomas was fully awake, his vision was blurry, but he recognized her immediately. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor smiled very slightly. "Long enough." Thomas looked around the house. He looked at the fire. He looked at the small pot of porridge simmering. He looked at Eleanor, thinner, more tired, but standing firm. He understands. No explanation is needed. In that silence, there was an acknowledgement deeper than any words. Someone had chosen to stay when he had nothing left to give. Thomas Hale turned away, as if to hide the emotions welling up inside him. But Eleanor saw. She said nothing. She added more firewood to the stove, stirred the porridge. "Sit down. Life goes on, no need for formalities." In the days that followed, Thomas recovered slowly. Eleanor continued to do everything, without complaining, without boasting. She did it because it was the right thing to do. One afternoon, when Thomas was able to sit up, he spoke very softly. "I thought she would leave." Eleanor paused for a moment. "He never promised anything," she said. "But I never promised to leave either." Thomas looked at her. This time his gaze didn't avoid hers. In that moment they understood something that only those who have experienced loss can understand. Love doesn't need vows to exist. It just needs someone to stay when things get toughest. Eleanor Whitmore had been abandoned before, but this time she was the one who chose not to abandon. And it was that very choice that deepened the bond between the two people, not through explosive emotions but through a quiet loyalty to each other's lives. As winter receded and Thomas Hale found his footing again, they both understood that there were things left unsaid, but also things that in due time needed to be acknowledged through a clear choice. Winter retreats quietly from the mountains. It didn't leave on a bright sunny day, but quietly let go, leaving behind traces of old, slowly melting snow at the foot of the forest. Water from the ice trickled down the rocky crevices, steadily, patiently, as if reminding us that all rebirth takes time. Thomas Hale has been able to stand up again. Slow, careful, but steady. Eleanor Whitmore stood in the doorway watching him step out onto the porch on his first morning without leaning against the wall. She didn't clap. She didn't cheer. She just took a deep breath as if it were the breath she had been holding back all winter. Thomas stood there for a long time, looking out at the forest. He said nothing, he just listened. The man once accustomed to solitude now perceived every sound and every silence in a different way. The mountains were the same. The house was the same. But the life within had changed. Eleanor returned to the kitchen, resuming her daily routine. She didn't ask Thomas if he was tired. She didn't mention the critical days. She didn't say how frightened she had been. There are some things that if spoken aloud will make them seem smaller, and Eleanor Whitmore didn't want to do that. The following days passed at a slow, familiar pace, but an invisible thread had changed the way things unfolded. Thomas started doing small tasks again, repairing traps, checking the roof, arranging firewood. Eleanor continued doing her part. No one took over anyone else's work. No one withdrew. It's just that they started looking at each other a little more. Don't look to inquire. Don't look to wait. Just looking as a way of confirming that the other person is still there. One afternoon, as Eleanor carried her basket of firewood into the house, Thomas stepped forward to help her. Their hands touched. It wasn't the first time. But this time neither of them withdrew their hand immediately. That moment didn't last long. It was just enough for Eleanor to realize that she was no longer avoiding this intimacy. Thomas realized that too. He didn't squeeze. He didn't pull closer. He held her hand for just one more moment, then let go. They continued with their work. But from then on, everything took on a different, more subdued quality. That evening, they sat closer together by the fire. Not so close, but close enough to feel each other's warmth. Eleanor mended Thomas's coat. He handed her the needle slowly, carefully, as if giving her something more important than the object itself. Thomas watched Eleanor work. It wasn't out of curiosity. It was because he was learning how to see someone who had chosen to stay. The man who had lived his entire life, driven by survival instinct, understood very well the value of that choice. It didn't stem from fleeting emotion. It came from a decision tested by winter and the fear of loss. One evening when the fire was reduced to glowing embers, Thomas spoke up. "No rush, no need to prepare your words. Eleanor." She looked up. Yes, Thomas looked at the fire. For a long time. Then he reached out his hand. Not strong, not shaky. It's just an open hand waiting to be grasped. Eleanor looked at the hand. She didn't think much. She didn't ponder. She didn't ask herself, "What does this mean?" She placed her hand there. A handshake carries no vows. There is no loud affirmation. But Eleanor sensed the full presence of the man sitting beside her. Thomas took a slow breath. "I don't want to live the rest of my life alone. Just one sentence. No additions or deletions. Not if you agree. Not I promise I will. This is simply the truth of someone who looked death straight in the face and came back." Eleanor Whitmore did not answer immediately. She didn't cry. She didn't smile broadly. She just held Thomas's hand a little tighter. "Me too," she said. "It's not an agreement in the social sense. Rather, it's the convergence of two independent decisions." Thomas nodded. No ring, no plans. There was only one unspoken understanding. From now on they would go on together, not because they needed to, but because they had chosen to. That night Eleanor lay down with a strange sense of peace. Not because the future had suddenly become certain, but because the present was stable enough to dispel her fear. She thought about Duston Creek, about the glances, about the whispers. It all feels weightless now, not because they're wrong, but because they no longer define her. Eleanor Whitmore was once judged by her appearance, by convenience, by the choices of others. Now she is recognized for staying there when another person needed her most. Thomas Hale wasn't a man who simply said, "I love you." He was a man who said what needed to be said when he was ready to face the consequences. The next morning, they woke up earlier than usual, not because of work, but because of the gentle, warm spring sunlight streaming through the window. Thomas made coffee. Eleanor placed the bread on the table. Everything was going on as usual, but it wasn't the same anymore. They didn't call each other by new names. They didn't change their way of life. It's simply that in each small thing a bond has been established. Eleanor understood that this love needed no proof. It had already been proven by Winter, and Thomas understood that from now on he no longer lived only for himself. Nobody said that. They don't need it. When Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Hale chose each other based on the simplest truth, a past that seemed to have been laid to rest suddenly resurfaced, bringing with it an offer tempting enough to challenge their newly established choice. Spring arrives late in the mountains, but when it does, it doesn't ask if anyone is ready. That morning, Eleanor Whitmore took her basket out onto the porch to air out the leftover meat from the winter. The air was more humid. Snow remained only in the shaded areas. The log cabin stood there, familiar, peaceful, as if nothing had ever been able to shake it. Thomas Hale descended the mountain early, leaving Eleanor alone in her usual routine. Nothing unusual. No warning signs. Until Eleanor saw the mailman. A strange man riding slowly on horseback stopped before the porch. Letters rarely arrived here. Eleanor paused for a moment, not out of nervousness, but because she thought her life had reached a point where letters were no longer necessary. The mailman handed over the envelope, nodded, and then turned away. Eleanor stood still, the letter in her hand. The envelope was clean. The paper was thick. The handwriting was familiar, all too familiar. Caleb Monroe. That name didn't make her heart ache. It didn't make her hands tremble. But it brought a whole layer of old memories to the surface, like ice melting in the sunlight. Not loudly, but inevitably. Eleanor brought the letter into the house. She placed it on the table. She didn't open it right away. She made tea, tidied up the kitchen, did the little things as if she needed more time to make sure she was standing in the present, not being pulled back to Duston Creek. Finally, Eleanor sat down. She opened the letter. Caleb Monroe wrote very politely, carefully, just as before. He apologized. No lengthy explanations, no blaming. He said he was wrong, that back then he was afraid of responsibility, afraid of the burden, afraid of a life that wouldn't turn out as he had imagined. He said that he was now settled in the city. He had a good job. He had a comfortable home. He was able to give Eleanor a more decent life. He wrote, "I've thought about her a lot, and if she's still willing, I'd like to make amends for the mistakes I've made." Not a word of reproach. Not a single mention of Duston Creek. It's simply an offer focused on convenience. Eleanor read the entire letter. Then she folded it up and placed it on the table. No rapid breathing, no crying. But deep inside her, an undercurrent began to stir. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitmore found herself in a very different situation. Not abandoned, not rejected. It's about choice. Caleb Monroe didn't write the letter because he needed Eleanor. He wrote it because Eleanor was now the right person. The truth came to Eleanor very clearly, and because of that it didn't hurt her as much as before, but it made her stop. She looked around the house, old wooden roof, rough dining table, uneven light coming through the window. No amenities, not wealthy. But this is where she survived the winter, where she held a man's hand when death was imminent. In the afternoon, Thomas Hale returned. He saw the letter immediately. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't rush to pick it up. He just looked at Eleanor. "Is there a letter?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "From Caleb Monroe." Thomas's expression remained unchanged. No frown, no evasiveness. He simply nodded slightly as if he had anticipated this long ago. Eleanor gave him the letter. Thomas read slowly, not missing a single sentence. When he finished, he folded the book and placed it back on the table in its original position. "He made many promises," Thomas said. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "That's how he always writes." A long silence followed, not heavy-handed, but thoughtful. Eleanor looked at Thomas Hale, a man who had never promised anything but the truth. A man who hadn't brought the city, hadn't brought comforts, but had brought a safe home and shelter when she needed it most. Then Eleanor looked at the letter. An apology, an invitation, another path, smoother, brighter, and more socially accepted. For the first time, Eleanor felt a real, internal struggle, not between two men, but between two versions of life. A life where she would be seen as fit up to standard, and a life where she would be seen as necessary. Thomas said nothing more. He didn't say, "I need you." He didn't say, "Stay with me." He simply said, "You should think carefully." And it was that very statement, without obligation, without coercion, that made Eleanor understand that this time the choice truly belonged to her. That night Eleanor didn't fall asleep right away. She sat by the window gazing at the forest in the darkness. A gentle spring breeze blew. It wasn't as cold as before. She thought of Duston Creek, a place where she had once had no choice but to endure. She thought about the city, a place she had never lived in but had been promised a place there. And she thought about this house where no one had ever promised her anything but everything necessary had been proven by action. Eleanor Whitmore realized something that surprised her. She was no longer afraid of losing a man. She was only afraid of losing herself again. Caleb Monroe promised her a comfortable life, but he never promised to stay when things got tough. Thomas Hale never promised anything, but he stayed, never once leaving. The next morning Eleanor carefully folded the letter and put it in an envelope. Don't tear it. Don't throw it away. She placed it on the shelf not to cling to hope but to honor the past that had brought her to the present. Thomas watched the action. He didn't ask any questions, but his gaze deepened, becoming more intense. Eleanor turned to him. I need more time, she said. Thomas nodded. She does. No more. No less. In that moment Eleanor understood that for the first time in her life she wasn't being pressured to answer immediately. And that's what makes the upcoming choice more important than any promise ever written. When Eleanor Whitmore held both the past and the present in her hands simultaneously, she understood that the choice she was about to make would not only determine where she lived, but also define the person she had become after everything she had been through. There are choices that don't come in dramatic moments. They come on very ordinary mornings when people are calm enough to hear themselves clearly. Eleanor Whitmore stood by the window, watching the early morning sun spread across the valley. The snow had almost completely melted. The ground was soft. Spring had finally arrived in the mountains, slowly but surely. Caleb Monroe's letter still sits on the wooden shelf. Not hidden, not torn up. It's there as a reminder that the past doesn't disappear just because we don't look at it. Eleanor had thought about it long enough. Don't think in a panic. Don't think based on fleeting emotions. Rather, it's about thinking based on everything she's lived through. She recalled Duston Creek, where she had stepped out of her carriage with fragile hope, where people looked at her as if she were a latecomer, where a woman's worth was determined in the first few seconds. She remembers the feeling of sitting and waiting at the bus station, each hour passing like a layer of hope crumbling away. She remembers the silent shame of knowing she had been judged as unworthy. Then she thought of the city Caleb Monroe had mentioned. A place with plenty of houses. There are paved streets. There are bright lights and shops right on the corner. A place where if she appeared alongside Caleb, people would nod in satisfaction. Ah, finally, everything is back in its place. The city gave her comfort. It gave her social recognition. It gave her a place where others understood and accepted her. But then Eleanor Whitmore turned back to look at the wooden house. Rough walls, a rustic dining table, traces of winter still visible on the windows. This place offered her no ease. It offered her no admiring glances. But this place gave her something else. Value. The value of labor. The value of staying. The value of being needed not because of fit but because of authenticity. Eleanor thought about the days Thomas Hale lay delirious with fever. About the nights she sat by his bedside listening to his breathing, not knowing what the next morning would bring. None of the cities in Caleb's promises contained those moments. Nothing can replace the feeling of being able to stand firm when you need it most. Thomas Hale wasn't in the room right now. He was out there repairing the fence as usual. He didn't know what Eleanor would decide, and he didn't ask to know. It was that very freedom that made Eleanor understand everything. Caleb Monroe used to write to her when he needed a solution. Now he's writing back when she's become a better option. Thomas Hale never wrote a letter. He didn't choose her because she was ready. He chose her because she was there. Eleanor Whitmore picked up the letter. She read it one last time. The apologies were well written. The promises were carefully crafted. None of the statements are wrong, but none of them touch upon what she has become. Eleanor sat down at the table and took out a pen and paper. She didn't write much. No need to recount the past. No need to explain. Write only what is true in the simplest way possible. He gave me an opportunity, but I found my life elsewhere. She paused for a moment. Then add one last line, not to condemn, not to determine victory or defeat. I don't need to be chosen anymore. I've already chosen. Eleanor Whitmore folded the letter. No shaking hands, no hesitation. She didn't feel like she had just rejected a man. She felt like she had rejected going back to being her old self. That afternoon, when Thomas Hale entered the house, he found Eleanor standing by the table. A new envelope lay neatly beside her. "Have you made your decision?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. Thomas didn't ask who to choose. He didn't ask what to choose. He just looked at her, waiting. "The city could have given me an easier life," Eleanor said, her voice slow and clear. "But this place has shown me who I am." Thomas nodded. He didn't smile. He showed no emotion. "That's enough," he said. Not a congratulatory message, not a promise. It was simply confirmation that he understood and respected. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. She looked toward the mountains. The spring breeze blew, carrying the scent of fresh earth. She felt a profound sense of relief, not because everything was settled, but because she no longer had to prove anything to anyone. She didn't choose Thomas Hale because he was safe. She didn't choose him because she was afraid of being alone. She chose to stay because here she wouldn't be judged by her past or appearance. She would be judged by what she did each day. Eleanor Whitmore once thought that her life would end in a compromise. But no, the pinnacle of her life wasn't about being chosen by someone. It was the moment she was strong enough to say, "I've already made my choice." And that choice needed no witnesses. It needed no applause. It only requires truth and courage, forged through loss. As the sun set behind the mountains, Eleanor and Thomas stood side by side, watching the light fade away. Nobody talks about the future. But they both knew, life from now on wouldn't be perfect, but it would be true for them. When Eleanor Whitmore made her choice with her whole being, what remained was not drama or revenge, but a quiet ending where dignity was preserved and life continued in serenity. There are endings that don't need a climax. They come gently, like a calm morning when people have lived long enough to understand that peace needs no proof. Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Hale's wedding took place on a late spring morning. There were no guests, no pristine white wedding dress, no music echoing through the woods. The sunlight was just warm enough. A clean wooden table stood nearby. A witness who had known Thomas for many years testified. Eleanor wore the simplest dress she owned, dark, neat, and not concealing the contours of a body that had lived and worked long enough. Thomas stood beside her, back straight, hands, still unnerved, unpretentious. They didn't swear many oaths. Simply answer yes, slowly and clearly. No one cried, no one applauded loudly. But in that moment everything was done. Not because of a ritual, but because these two people had chosen each other beforehand, through the coldest days, the longest nights, and a commitment that needed no promise. Life didn't change much after the wedding. Thomas continued with his work. Eleanor continued with her familiar routine. There's only one very small difference, but it's enough to make a difference. They no longer live next to each other. They live together. A few months later, they decided to go down to Duston Creek. Not to go back to the past. Not to prove anything. It was just a matter of buying a few things, and it was then that Eleanor Whitmore understood that some doors should only be opened when one is strong enough. The road leading down to town was still the same. Dusty, dry wind. Duston Creek appeared before them, smaller than Eleanor remembered. It hadn't changed much. The old wooden houses, the familiar inn, the carriage station where she used to sit in silence. Eleanor walked into town, her back straight. No arrogance, no defiance. She's just a woman who no longer bows her head. A few eyes recognized her. Some whispered. Some looked more closely. But no one said anything. It wasn't because Eleanor won, but because she is no longer in a position to be judged. Thomas walked beside her, not holding her hand tightly, not being protective, just being there, close enough, visible enough. They stopped by the store, bought what they needed, paid in full, thanked properly. No one mentions the past, no one needs to. Eleanor paused for a moment in front of the old inn, looking up at the second-floor window where she used to sit that night, swallowing her tears, thinking her life was over. She wasn't sad, nor was she angry. There was only a very slight closing. Thomas looked at her. "Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded. Okay. And this time it wasn't a lie to hide anything. It was the truth. They left Duston Creek while the sun was still high in the sky. No looking back. No need. That town had played its role in Eleanor Whitmore's life. It taught her something very valuable. A person's worth doesn't lie in being chosen by others, but in whether or not they dare to choose themselves. The following years passed peacefully. The wooden house has been renovated. The vegetable garden is bigger. Winter is still harsh, but I'm no longer alone. Eleanor and Thomas did not become a story to be told with admiration. They were simply two decent, hard-working people who silently upheld each other's honor. In the evening they sat by the fire. Not many words were needed. Not constant eye contact was necessary. Just knowing that the other person was there and would continue to be there. Eleanor sometimes thinks about Caleb Monroe. No resentment, no regrets. It's like thinking about a path she should have taken back then, a path she wouldn't have become the person she is today. She doesn't need to forgive him, because she no longer carries that wound. Thomas Hale never became the perfect man. Eleanor Whitmore never became the woman admired by society, but they became true to themselves. And for an audience that has lived through decades of life, this is what brings the story to a halt, not in loud tears, but in a very familiar feeling. Life isn't easy, but if people choose to live decently, they can still find each other. One late afternoon, Eleanor stood on the porch watching the sunset over the valley. Thomas stood beside her shoulder to shoulder. Nobody said anything, no need, because some stories don't end in words. They end in the serenity of those who have been healed. Eleanor Whitmore's story isn't a romantic quest for love in the familiar sense. It's a journey of a person rediscovering their own worth after being judged, rejected, and scorned by society simply because of their appearance, age, and circumstances. The biggest lesson the story teaches is, a person's worth is not determined by the opinions of others, but by how they live when no one is on their side. Eleanor was not saved. She rose up on her own through hard work, resilience, and the choice to live decently in the harshest circumstances. Thomas Hale didn't love her because she was perfect, but because she was real, present, responsible, and kind. That was the most enduring kind of love. No flowery words, no empty promises, just a commitment to staying. In modern life, many of us, especially those who have passed the halfway point of our lives, have experienced the feeling of being left behind, of being judged as no longer relevant. This story reminds us that it's never too late to choose your life over again. And you don't need to be chosen by anyone to be valuable. You just need the courage to choose yourself. Thank you for listening and for accompanying us on this journey. If this story touches a memory, an emotion, or a part of your life, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to tell humane, slow-paced, and healing stories for hearts that have lived, loved, and still believe in humanity. The story of Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Hale is not a fairy tale. There are no miracles, no dramatic life-changing events. There are only small, repeated choices. Live a good life, work hard, and don't turn your back on others when they need you most. And sometimes that's enough to create a fair ending. An ending that leaves people speechless and then makes them believe in humanity again.